Hello, I'm Shali Shankar, founder and managing partner of AIM Partners Fund. Our fund invests in technology companies at the intersection of oceans, areas that have been historically overlooked. It is my pleasure today to welcome you to our plenary discussion, Guiding Investments Towards Sustainable Ocean Industry Practices. I'm joined today by four excellent and very experienced panelists: Terry Downs, Chief Operating Officer of Sealaska; Dennis Frisch, Sustainable Blue Finance Lead, UNEP Finance Initiative; Isabel Hoffman, Capitals Coalition; and Stephanie von Friedberg from the IFC. You will find the full biographies of our panelists on the screen under this media player. To kick off the discussion, I would like to start with you, Terry. It has been great to see serious investment capital coming into the ocean sector. A lot of that capital is coming in unconventional form, structuring for-profit investment opportunities that not only do no harm to the environment or people, but in some instances are creating unique opportunities. It seems like Sealaska is one such example. Could you tell us a little bit about this fairly unique ownership structure and how that has facilitated investment in the ocean health and community?
Of course, yeah, happy to. So Sealaska is a unique corporation. It was created in 1971 when the U.S. government settled the Aboriginal land claim that the Alaskan people had had pending since statehood. The basis of the claim being that Alaska was never Russia's to sell; it belonged to them. So a private for-profit corporation was created in 1971. That was how the final settlement was realized. And to be eligible to be a shareholder of that corporation, you had to demonstrate that your ethnicity was substantially one of the native tribes that traditionally inhabited that region. And so then you're eligible to be a shareholder. You can't sell your shares in Sealaska, but you get gifted. You can gift them to your family. So we end up with 23,000 shareholders that can trace their ancestry back 12,000 years, that have a shared heritage and culture that traditionally subsisted from the ocean for most of their history. And we've decided in about 7 or 8 years ago, that would be the essence of our strategy, and that would be the defining characteristic of the company we were going to build. We call it Ocean Health, and we've been using this vehicle to invest in ocean health for the last 7 or 8 years, and bought about 12 companies in that period, and grown organically too.
Thank you. Moving on to Dennis. Dennis, you lead United Nations Sustainable Blue Economy Finance Initiative, which has brought together banks, insurers, investors to develop guidelines and tools to not only help financial institutions align their activities, but also come together. From your perspective, why is ocean health important for financial institutions?
Thanks, Shelley. Happy to be here. Just briefly around about UNIFI. So we are a partnership between the UN Environment Programme and the private financial sector, and we work with more than 450 banks, insurers, and institutional investors to develop the global sustainable finance agenda. And specifically to today's topic, we also convene a community of practice on sustainable blue finance, which is focusing really on providing guidance and tools to ensure that investment, underwriting, and lending activities are aligned to UN SDG 14, life below water. And the question that you pose is an interesting one, because the ocean and ocean health is really at the center of many of the major industries globally. Of course, we all know the ocean covers 70% or 71% of our planet, and is home to the majority of all life, and really is the largest ecosystem on Earth. It has a major role in regulating the global climate. It has the largest natural carbon sink, and produces every second breath we take. It provides seafood, the primary source of protein for almost 3 billion people, and other coastal marine ecosystems like coral reefs, mangrove forests also act as natural barriers which protect coastal communities from storms and floods. So from a kind of societal stance, I think that the importance of ocean health is very easy to see. But as I said, all these goods, services, and economic activities we derive from the ocean are have an economic value, and they're estimated to be the equivalent to the world's seventh largest economy in GDP terms. So that means the annual value of ocean assets is estimated at around 2.5 trillion US dollars. And we have, as I said, major global industries that depend on or impact the ocean's health. Examples are shipping, of course, tourism, seafood, offshore renewable energy, and they all rely on a healthy ocean and a healthy flow of finance and insurance to underpin their operations. And of course, banks, insurers, and investors are those organizations that provide this finance and insurance to make these ocean-linked sectors operate. And therefore, financial institutions have quite significant leverage to transform such sectors at pace. And we do luckily see increasingly financial institutions seeking ways to lower their exposure to unsustainable practices in the ocean space. And we really also see an urgency for the need to transition a lot of these ocean-linked sectors to a what we call sustainable blue economy. There was a study out in last year that really finally put a number to this urgency. A business-as-usual approach across ocean-linked sectors will leave the world's economy, or rather two-thirds of all listed companies, 8.4 trillion US dollars out of pocket over the next 15 years. And that's, of course, a massive number. However, if we act swiftly on changing our approaches to ocean resources, we'll be able to lower this burden significantly. And that's, of course, a huge incentive for action for the financial community. I'll leave it at that, and maybe can speak about that a bit more later.
Absolutely. Moving on to you, Isabel, you have a very unusual role where your organization aims to make visible the impacts and dependencies of ocean-based businesses, very much what Dennis talked about. From your perspective, how can businesses and finance benefit from measuring the value of their relationship with the oceans?
Yeah, very much like what Dennis was just saying. You know, every organization impacts and depends on the ocean in a certain way. But a lot of these times, these relationships are hard to understand because they're not economically visible. So that means that a lot of the time businesses are making these crucial decisions based on incomplete information. And of course, that leads to inefficient or ineffective or even damaging outcomes for the organization, but also for nature, the stakeholders, and broader society. So we need to rethink how we understand value in relation to our decision making. And that's where this idea of the capitals come in. So capital has traditionally been thought of as money, but actually capital is anything that stores value or that yields a value to people. So immediately you see that has to be more than just money. It's nature, it's people, it's societies, or what we would call natural, social, and human capital. So this capitals approach, it's a way of making decisions that takes into account the value of these four capitals. And there are three main differences in this type of decision making from traditional decision making. The first of which is that we look not only at impacts, but also at dependencies. Now, all of these different organizations, they depend on the ocean, they depend on the different capitals. And once they understand that they need these elements, they're going to look after them. So it's a real way of being able to see what the business case is for conserving these capitals. The other difference is that we move from measurement to valuation. So we're not just looking at company uses X amount of water, but we're looking at what does that water use mean in its context? Is it being taken from water scarce areas? Are there people living in this area? What does that actually mean in terms of the more wider impact on the system? And that brings us to the third main difference, is that we're not just looking at these elements in isolation. They really are considered as a system. And there's significant opportunity for organizations that make these decisions based on the value of the different capitals. And I'll go into more of that later. But this is in its essence what the Capitals Coalition is trying to do. We're a global collaboration that brings together all the different organizations that are working to integrate the value of organizational relationships with the capitals into core decision making. And our shared ambition is that by 2030, the majority of businesses, finance, and governments will use capitals in their decision making, and that will lead to a nature positive and socially just global economy.
Thank you. Talking about capital, Stephanie, turning on to you since you're managing IFC's 60 billion debt and equity portfolio in about 100 countries right now. And it seems like you seek to attract private capital in emerging markets to achieve positive development outcomes. Why is it important to get more private capital into blue economy in the emerging economies?
So, Shayla, thank you for the question. And I actually think that Dennis did a very good job laying the foundations for the importance of the ocean. But let me just take a step back. So the International Finance Corporation is the private sector arm of the World Bank Group. And our job is to create jobs and economic growth through private sector development in sustainable ways. So when we think about our objectives, the ocean is at the heart of a great amount of that. And the business that surrounds the ocean squarely fits within that purview. Dennis rightly said it's a $2.5 trillion market, and it represents the 7th largest source of GDP growth globally. So it has to play a part of how we think about development. So we've actually defined the blue economy very clearly. It is the sustainable use of ocean resources for economic growth, jobs, and improved livelihood. So the first thing that we need to do is ensure that we keep the ocean and the marine ecosystem healthy. For small island states, it represents 70% of a source of protein, and actually fish is one of the fastest growing sources of animal protein in the world. So how are we feeding the planet? 97% of all fishermen come from emerging markets, and it's generated 350 million jobs. So at the core, it is fundamental to how we create sustainable development going forward and strong economic growth globally, both in emerging and developing countries.
Thank you. Since I have you here, maybe you could continue and give us some thoughts on what is your perspective on the opportunities and gaps that you see, given the backdrop that Dennis laid out for us.
Yeah. So actually, I'm a glass half full person. I think there's maybe more opportunity than there is challenges. But let me start with the opportunities. And I think that Dennis referenced some of them. But when I think about where should IFC and where should other development finance institutions be investing in the blue economy, it's both ocean-based and land-based investments that affect the ocean. So think about sustainable port logistics, ocean-friendly products, fisheries and aquatics, sustainable tourism. When you think about the fact that 50% of all tourists are destined to coastal areas, thinking about ecotourism is really important. So I think there's a whole range of companies and opportunities that exist. And maybe an example I would use is we recently helped a company in Asia pull 50 million plastic bottles out of the ocean. So trash, convert that trash to value and do something that was good for the ocean. That's the kind of investment in the blue economy we're going to be looking for and we're going to continue to push for. But where I see the challenges is maybe a couple of different places. First, it's a really new space for development finance institutions to be investing in. And if you look at OECD numbers, they estimated that between 2014 and 2017, there was only about $3 billion of investment supported by public money moving into the blue economy. And just to put that in perspective for you, in 2017 alone, IFC did tenfold that across its entire portfolio. So we have a long way to go, and we have a lot of projects that need to be developed. So that's the first thing, the first challenge I see. Dennis mentioned bonds. I would say bonds, blue loans, and insurance are all really critical products that we need to build out just in the same fashion that we did green bonds and green lending. And then the final area I would touch on really, Shaylee, is blended finance. So when I look across at making viable projects, some of these are not going to be bankable on a standalone basis, and they're going to take first loss positions and blended finance to mix the commercial and concessional funding to make them viable projects. And I don't have to look much further than what we did in solar. So when I started investing in solar, it was 25 cents a kilowatt hour. It's now under 2.5 cents. And we really did that by a combination of using blended finance to buy down the cost of technology and pushing as fast as we could the development of solar so the cost curves came down. I see that opportunity happening again in offshore wind, and the magnitude of offshore wind is substantially larger and more complex than onshore solar. So that's an area where we all need to be thinking collectively about where do we find those right resources to bring these projects to bear.
Thank you. Terry, you have a fairly unusual perspective given the work you have done so far and the projects you have ahead. What do you think are the challenges and opportunities from your perspective?
And I agree with everything that's been said. I think that the opportunities are myriad, and the challenges are surmountable. I think we've got the technology, the knowledge, the passion to fix these problems. So I think there's a lot of work to do, but it can be done. I think one of the challenges is information. We have pretty poor understanding of our oceans. I mean, one of our businesses is understanding the geology of the ocean bed prior to installing offshore wind farms. And in a lot of cases, it's evolving, but the technology generally used around the world to understand the geology of the seabed is 60 years old. It's often required having a vessel over the oceans, and sending equipment down, drilling equipment down from the vessel itself. And there's opportunities to do that remotely, for example. There's opportunities to gather information, get better information about what's going on in our oceans with respect to temperature, acidity, the geology of the ocean floor, the thermal conductivity of the ocean floor. Just a simple example, as wind farms are going further offshore, they're getting bigger and the power is having to be distributed, for further. There's massive loss of energy, up to 25% potentially, as wind farms go further offshore. So understanding the thermal conductivity and optimizing cables are laid and the technology of the cables can make a really massive impact on those offshore wind farms being more efficient. That's just one example. And if we switch to more conventional forms of using our ocean, for example, seafood, and as was correctly pointed out, that's fundamental to not only the livelihood of many people in the developing world, but also feeding people across the world. And there's opportunities to do that better as well. And some of that's about information too. In a simplistic way, like 70% of seafood eaten in the US is misidentified. It's very difficult to understand what you're eating as a consumer, to make good choices. And there's also a lot of waste. All those things can be solved, and that could double the food supply without having any incremental impact on fishing. And managing fishing better would increase the ability to feed people healthy products from the ocean too. I can see a future where food from the ocean quintuples in the next 20 years. It's very important, not just because it's good for the planet, it's so important for so many communities around the world. It's also important because it reduces the impact on land and enables us to put some agricultural land and forests back to more traditional ecosystems, which act as a carbon sink and also development for wildlife and habitat.
Thank you. Moving back to you, Dennis. You have said in the past that financial sector has a fairly unique opportunity to steer ocean industries towards sustainabilities. What are the opportunities from your perspective that you see in the ocean sector? And most importantly, how do you think we should assess value?
I think that's a really good question, and I do support what Terry and Stephanie just mentioned. I think the opportunities are relatively clear. Of course, societal, you can contribute to SDG 14, which spans loads of benefits ranging from livelihood improvement to biodiversity benefits, climate adaptation. There's much value, for example, in ensuring that coastal ecosystems are protected for the benefit of coastal communities and assets, for example, real estate, reducing future damage through storms, floods, sea level rise, and so on, while presenting many co-benefits for biodiversity and other sectors. And financial institutions that get involved in this space, because it is so new, there's a big opportunity to be a leader and a pioneer in this space, to be part of innovative new deals. Stephanie mentioned blue bonds, but also there's a lot of sustainable ocean funds supporting solution-oriented businesses that are popping up right now. trying to address the solutions that, the issues that Terry just mentioned. But from a financial institution view, I think it's also important to think about that, taking into account ocean health, or marine ecosystems in your decision making means improving risk mitigation by incorporating a holistic assessment of risk exposure to ocean health decline to your business, something which has likely not happened yet for many organizations, and also assuring that the ocean-linked sectors that you deal with as a financial institution, as a bank, investor, or insurer are resilient and their profits stable into the future, taking into account relationships between sectors. So, for example, how runoff from agriculture affects coastal fisheries, or how plastic pollution can affect marine tourism. So it's really taking this holistic view of all ocean-linked sectors and their interaction that's very much beneficial for financial institutions. And I think on the gap side, or on the downside, maybe I want to highlight two things. One of them is the lack of expertise that we see quite a lot. So despite recent popularity that I mentioned earlier, most of the wider financial community lacks practical ocean finance expertise. And that's where global and science-based finance standards and guidelines are crucial in giving a clear direction to transform ocean-linked sectors. And we host the Sustainable Blue Economy Finance Principles, which are really the world's foremost high-level guiding framework to align financing activities with SDG 14, Life Below Water. And the second one that I would like to highlight, the second issue, is the lack of a track record. So the ocean finance space, because it is relatively new, is not yet straightforward to navigate. So, and while a track record of sustainable blue projects is slowly developing, the transparency and knowledge sharing across the financial community needs to increase. And therefore, I think collaboration between public and private actors, for example, the World Bank or others, needs to increase to further mainstream global standards that can empower stakeholder action, which will certainly go a long way in showing that sustainable blue finance can work in practice.
Thank you. I started writing the statistics you were quoting, but then decided maybe we'll all go to your website and see a lot of those examples. Going to you, Isabel, what are the opportunities and challenges you see in relation to valuing ocean capital?
Yeah, so I'd like to just add an extra challenge to the two that Dennis just mentioned. I totally agree with all the opportunities mentioned. I think one of the big problems that we often get asked about is this issue of the lack of flow of relevant information to investors. So from the source to the investors, there's a sort of breakdown of the information available. And in terms of valuing different capitals, that can actually really help to enable that flow, because it yields information that's usable and relevant to everyone. So a natural capital valuation, for example, it can often translate non-tangible benefits or information about nature in monetary terms. So it's a language that everybody understands, from the business to the financer. So that's really helpful for sustainable businesses or sustainable projects, for example, because they can demonstrate how they are creating value for the capitals, like how they're restoring biodiversity, how they're helping nature. And that's obviously going to attract investors, because a lot of investors at the moment are looking for impact. And so it's a translatable way of being able to show that. And then on the other end, investors can use this information about the different capitals to map out their risks, and to make their capital allocations based on more complete information than just on financial information.
Thank you. Stephanie, given that you are investing in these geographies and specifically in the ocean sector, what kind of opportunities are you finding on the ground? And what can we do to get more private capital into blue economy, especially in emerging markets? Is it policy? Is it liquidity? Is it infrastructure? Is it partnerships that you see as bottlenecks? And maybe you could share a few examples of how your organization has made an impact in this area.
Shaylee, it's a good question. And I want to reiterate what Dennis said, because I think he started to frame the conversation perfectly. I actually think we need maybe three things that fit into the how are we going to do more of this. First, we do need guidelines. This is a really young sector, and it's a very young sector for development finance institutions. And so, investors, when they're uncertain, won't invest. And so they're going to be asking natural questions. What's the risk return trade-off? What does sustainability mean in relation to blue? What's the definition of a blue investment? And, more sophisticated investors are going to be asking us, okay, but how are you actually measuring the impact that you're intending to have? So all of those kinds of things need to get answered. I know that Dennis's organization works with that framework. So creating the right principles for the blue economy and the guidelines that go with them will be critical. We've done this with green bonds and green loans, and now there is a global international standard that we can tag projects to, and we're also capable of measuring the impact. The green bonds really did come from partnership, and it's going to take a village around blue to do exactly the same thing. We've actually issued some interesting guidelines on our own that kind of mirror the way we think about the green economy. Very helpful. The second one, as you rightly said, is policy. So again, investors like predictable regulation and predictable regulators. They also don't like antagonistic policy. They're not going to invest while policy doesn't match. So in our countries of operation, we actually use our performance standards as the benchmark because it's often too complex to rely solely on policy and regulation in the country. And our performance standards really set a very high bar in terms of doing the right thing from a sustainability perspective, and especially as it relates to oceans. And then finally, I said this at the beginning, and I still believe this, we need more projects. We actually have an initiative called our Upstream Initiative where we're trying to develop specific projects around the blue economy and the circular economy because there aren't enough of investable projects, and we're beginning to see more and more investors interested in the space, but not capable of coming into projects because, again, they don't understand the risk-reward trade-off, and having institutions like IFC at the table helps bring that and attract that capital.
Thank you. Dennis, did you want to add something to that?
Yeah, I'd love to take the opportunity to jump in on Stephanie's points. I think specifically around principles and standards, guidance. As I mentioned earlier, we host a Sustainable Blue Economy Finance Principles and convene a community of practice of more than 70 pioneering institutions, including the World Bank, for example. And we have launched last year market-first guidance for financial institutions, specifically on 5 key ocean-linked sectors, namely shipping, seafood, marine renewable energy, ports, and coastal tourism. And this really is a quite practical resource recommending on how to approach environmental and social considerations across these sectors. And since then, we've been quite involved on trying to see some successes working with our members, financial institutions, on implementation of these recommendations. And we've just published in February some examples showcasing progress and the process that these financial institutions went through in terms of implementation, which should contribute to that crucial track record that Stephanie mentioned of ocean finance projects. And following on to that, we're now publishing additional blue finance guidance focusing on plastics and waste management, as well as coastal infrastructure and resilience. And this practical resource, which is called Diving Deep, Finance, Ocean Pollution and Coastal Resilience, is out now. And it brings financial institutions quite clear guidance on which financial activities to seek out, which to challenge, and which to avoid completely. So that means we highlight across all these ocean-linked sectors what best practice looks like, what topics are crucial for engagement with clients, but also what activities are potential red flags that should be avoided due to their negative impact on people or environment and their high risk for financial institutions. And to be very practical, you can find both of these guidance documents as well as a list of recommended exclusions for free on our website. So I would recommend any financial institution that's tuned in today to check these out and give us feedback as well.
Yeah, and I'll add to that we have taken all the work that Dennis has done and translated it as a venture fund, as a technology fund, into how do you evaluate companies specifically and how do you build sector and portfolio expertise based on that. So yeah, so that's another offer. If anybody's interested, happy to share that information. Switching gears and moving to you, Terry. You have actually done a very meaningful task. You've built a consumer driven seafood business, which is led by a group of founders who work together, prioritize sustainable practices. Could you share examples of how you and your organizations have made an impact or areas you're looking ahead and will be taking a lot of the conversation today and translating into tangible projects?
Yeah, so we've built an organization from scratch, and what we've really done is scour the world for like-minded people, fundamentally, for people that really believe in the things everyone's been talking about to date. And we've acquired businesses, and we're building a supply chain. And we got the advantage of building the supply chain today. We got the advantage that we started 5 years ago. A lot of people in the seafood industry have their inherited supply chain that may be imperfect, but we've been piecing together a business from scratch with a view to trying to address the challenges that we've all been talking about, the fundamentally around waste, getting more value from seafood, getting more utility from every fish, ensuring that every part of the fish is used. A lot of these things are purely logistical in nature, that the supply chain is chopped up, and the fishery is not. And there's, in seafood in general, there's many different actors at every stage of the supply chain rather than an integrated solution. Seafood tends to be a very fragmented business, especially if it's wild seafood, and the product raw material is changing ownership many times in the supply chain, and that leads to inefficiency. Partly because people are second guessing each other, partly because there's imperfect information, and partly, frankly, there's not often healthy, good, honest stewardship of the product. And it is a global business by nature, and often a global business where the interface between the product that's being consumed, for example, by the consumer sold at a retailer, final interface has very little knowledge about the origin and the story of the product itself. So those are the solutions we're trying to fix, and we're doing it by building a supply chain by scratch and making investments in the best managed fisheries in the world, around Iceland, around Norway, in Alaska, in fisheries that have used science really well now for decades, and are beginning to see that they can harvest very efficiently and effectively without impacting the ability of the fishery to replenish itself. And in conjunction with that, using conventional branding tools, bringing people from other sectors who are experts in building brands, who are experts in using some of the other products that are byproducts of traditional forms of protein, like a fillet, and ensuring and co-partnering in our facilities and having those companies actually co-located with us. So they're taking those what would have been traditionally considered waste streams and turning them into value-added products. And one example is dried food for pets. I mean, traditionally using fish waste as pet food is not a new idea, but drying it and making it into a doggy snack increases the value by up to 100-fold. That's just one simple thing that's been done.
Thank you. And you've done a lot of pioneering work. If people wanted to learn about the work you're doing, a lot of information is available, and I'm sure you do a lot of learning and coaching to the community as well.
Try to, yeah, but frankly, we're really interested in learning from other people. Honestly, we just started on this journey. I think we just scratched the surface. We built up, an ocean health business is about 500 million in sales, but as we talked about before, the opportunities are enormous. And I agree with what Stephanie said. I mean, working with really original, thoughtful partnerships, I think, are essential to success here. We got the advantage of we partner with a whole array of different people, from communities to to entrepreneurs to established companies in the sector, and that's really been the key to our progress. Has been partnering with people, learning from them, being very open to be proven wrong, being very open to rethinking solutions, and frankly, borrowing and stealing ideas from more established industries and bringing them into this sector.
Thank you. Isabel, you had mentioned during one of our conversations that you're keen to see how we move from principles to practice. What are some of the examples on how you're seeing valuing the capital can actually help develop ocean health as well as businesses and finance?
Yeah, so I want to come back as well on what the others were saying earlier about the need for guidelines and the real need for generating evidence. The ocean in particular, it's a very multidimensional and complicated space. And that's all the more reason for needing a robust decision-making framework that really yields replicable information for decision-making that can be used in any geography, any context, any sector. I want to flag the Natural Capital Protocol, which is a decision-making framework for businesses that does this, and some work that the Capitals Coalition is developing in the ocean space in particular, to try and support ocean-based businesses that are very much less representative in the case study database that we have on our website. I want to give you a couple of examples of where some companies have been doing this. Particularly in the insurance space. That's an area that is a real interest at the moment. And I want to quote an article by Lloyd's of London, who released a report that shows that natural coastal habitats like mangroves and coral reefs and salt marshes, they protect communities much more effectively against coastal storms than seawalls or other grey infrastructure. And they argue that investment to conserve these natural habitats makes sense for insurers, and it's around 30 times cheaper than building seawalls on average. And that information would have come from a natural capital valuation of really seeing what nature is bringing as a value. Another interesting case is that of Marilla's Foundation, who did a natural capital valuation of their marine protected areas in the Balearics. And they found that the ecosystem service contribution of these marine protected areas, they found that for every €1 invested, it yielded €10 in return. And that's really useful information to drive the allocation of resources into the conservation of certain areas and to attract funding in other situations, because you can really see what the value is to people. And there are multiple ways that you can use this information. I won't go into more detail now. You can find lots more on our website, but really this is crucial to informing ESG criteria beyond those that are used at the moment to really show how capitals can bring value to people and not just looking at impacts.
Thank you. Stephanie, what is the key piece of advice you can share with the audience, or any key action points based on your experience that you would like to leave the audience with?
So, Shayla, I actually think it's that we need to rethink the way that at least I as a development practitioner think about how we do development. So for us, we've always been land-based. And I mean that literally. We think of our investments and our approach at the country level. And yet when you look at the importance of the ocean and its implications across such a broad swath of the ability to create economic growth and jobs, we need to ensure that we're looking horizontally and more holistically and ensuring, I think, as Isabel was trying to say, that we look at human capital, we look at natural capital, and we look at financial capital together, so that as we think about generating projects for the future, they're both sustainable and they're good for pulling people out of extreme poverty.
Dennis, any key messages you'd like to leave the audience with?
Yeah, sure. I think the one question we always get is, where can banks, insurers, and investors start in this journey? And I think it's become clear that we really need to scale up action on mainstreaming holistic sustainability considerations that are based on science across ocean-linked sectors. And financial institutions can act as enablers of change by using their expertise in finding opportunities and understanding of risk, and using the Sustainable Blue Economy Finance principles and associated guidance that I just mentioned earlier. They're really crucial tools in the financial institution's toolbox. So as a first step, I would say use these resources. And I really encourage anyone in the audience today to start evaluating their organization's impact on the marine environment, to show leadership on this topic, and to crucially share your experience with peers.
Thank you. Terry, anything you'd like to share?
Yeah, just briefly, as everyone's kind of alluded to, in some cases, I think Isabel's example is a terrific one. we have to completely change our relationship with the ocean as a species. It's historically been a dumping ground too often. Munitions is a simple example, and we have to think of it as a species. We can't come at it thinking of it as nations. We can't be territorial. We have to work together as a species to address these issues, and all the traditional barriers have to go out the window.
Thank you. This was amazing to talk to you all and get your perspective. And to quickly summarize, maybe I'll summarize with the problem statement that Isabel raised, which is that we have to change our relationship with the oceans. But I'll move on to Terry's comment. We have challenges, but those challenges are surmountable. So, leaving everybody on that positive note, it's been a pleasure talking to you all and look forward to seeing more of you on the ground.